As economic warning signs continue to increase, an entire panel of MAGA Fox News hosts publicly panicked on air about the likelihood of a recession under Donald Trump, but then they desperately tried to blame it on none other than Joe Biden, who is no longer president. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, as we've discussed in previous videos, the warning signs in this economy are starting to increase. Inflation is ticking up again on Trump's watch. Tariffs have triggered a punitive trade war that is painful and unnecessary, and Trump is trying to walk it back after markets crashed, and we're seeing a plummeting of consumer confidence. And again, the signs are mounting that on Donald Trump's watch, a recession is imminent. And this MAGA Fox News panel is reacting to it, but they're desperate to try to pin the blame on somebody else. So we're going to play these clips and unpack it together.
Rally, and you know what I say? This rally is about the Fed, okay? This is a Fed rally, Charles Payne. This is an expectation that the jobs picture is weakening, weaker than expected jobs again in the month of February, according to the Labor Department, tells you that the Fed is going to cut rates.
Yeah, and, you know, the street, as I was saying before we even came to this segment, moved up to 3, now maybe even more than that. And it's just, you know, Wall Street, listen, right now what we're going through is a tariff tantrum in Wall Street. But the ultimate tantrum is when they don't get their way with the Federal Reserve. And so this puts the Fed back into the ball game. It puts it back into the picture.
So this is in response to a lackluster February jobs report under Trump. We usually had stellar ones under President Biden, but this first one, with respect to Donald Trump's first full month in office, not looking good. Here's another clip.
Yeah, well, look, we've got a meeting coming up. Does anybody on this panel think that the Fed is going to cut rates at the next meeting?
Well, I don't think they should. I mean, I guess I'm the skunk at this garden party. I just don't see a case for lower interest rates right now. We still have inflation running at the 3 to 4% range.
True.
It's really critical for the economy and for Trump himself to make sure. Look, why did Biden and Kamala Harris lose the election? Issue number one of the American people, Maria, was inflation. People hate it. And it's critical that we keep prices, you know, stable and bring them down. And I don't see how an interest rate cut right now would do that. The other thing
So that was Stephen Moore, a top Trump advisor. He actually literally wrote a book, you know, pretending that Donald Trump was this master economist and had an unprecedentedly good economy that he single-handedly built. Again, full of shit, but you can hear the panic in his voice. He's worried about the next moves of the Federal Reserve. And he did acknowledge, I mean, it was true that, you know, the perception was that President Biden and Vice President Harris were not good stewards of the economy, although I would argue on the merits. They've been objectively better than the Trump administration, certainly Trump term 1, because Biden inherited a shitty economy, and Trump in both term 1 and term 2 inherited pretty good recovered economies from Presidents Obama and Biden. I digress. But he's recognizing the potential political consequences of this, and he acknowledges that inflation under Trump is rising. It was dropping under President Biden, but in part as a consequence of Trump's threats of tariffs, inflation is starting to tick up again, right? Remember, Trump promised, he vowed to be able to end inflation on day one. He bragged about it on the campaign trail. It's just so damn good. He could end it on day one. He didn't. Not only did inflation not even stabilize, prices remained up, they started to increase on his watch. And Stephen Moore is well aware of the potential political consequences for Trump and the Republican Party, as Democrats should continue to point out. Here's another clip.
That's, by the way, that's why I said earlier it would be Biden's recession. And I know the haters out there will slam me later. The other day I said something and they went nuts on me on Twitter, on X. I said, well, how come I don't see any Dodge Rams or Dodge, you know, pickup trucks in Europe? And they went nuts on it. But it's true. I see all the Mercedes and the Audis and the whole nine.
So again, just desperate. See, there is a recession, but it's Joe Biden's recession. Well, Joe Biden is a president. Donald Trump is president. And you all set the standard that whenever something bad happens on a president's watch, it's that president's fault. Remember when global inflation post-COVID was Joe Biden's fault, even though obviously it wasn't, because even conservative governments in G7 nations and advanced economies like the United Kingdom also suffered enormous inflation, considerably worse, quite frankly, than the United States' own. Well, even though that was a global trend, a global consequence of disrupted supply chains and stimulus, and by the way, Donald Trump passed 2 major COVID stimulus packages on his watch as well, but again, apparently that doesn't count. They try to gerrymander it very carefully. government spending, stimulus causes inflation, except for Trump's. That doesn't count. That was non inflationary stimulus. Only the Biden stuff. And then, when bad stuff happens on a president's watch, it's their fault, except when the president's a Republican, then obviously but that doesn't count. And then when a Democrat was like recently president, the bad stuff is because of them. Now, if anything good happens in this economy, even now, it must be because of Trump. But you see how they're so transparent. And she's Maria Bartiromo is at least self-aware enough to acknowledge that she's going to be criticized for this obviously, transparently partisan and disingenuous analysis, but doesn't stop her from making it. We're probably heading for a recession, but it's going to be Joe Biden's recession. Okay, here's another clip.
Even though those are low-paying jobs, the restaurant jobs and the leisure and hospitality jobs, they had sort of been a proxy for people having disposable money. A couple of days ago, Bank of America came out with their credit card data, and it was scary. I mean, a shocking declines in restaurants, airlines, lodging. Just look at the most recent poll on people who say they're going to go traveling in the next few months. It has plunged. I think the boom times are over. All the free money has been spent. And this is why I have a problem, Steve, with the Federal Reserve and interest rates, because if they look at aggregate data, it looks great. And so but the problem is that if 10% are doing 50% of buying and everyone else is struggling because of higher rates, it's a no-win situation. In other words, we've got to wait until the richest people in America stumble before there's any relief from Main Street. And I think in addition to blowing up all the ways we examine data, we need to figure out a way for the Fed to re-examine how they do their job, the transmission of their policies, because they keep telling us they wield a mallet. Well, we need to find a way to wield the scalpel, because
so again, there's Charles Payne freaking out about the situation, acknowledging that, again, consumer financial spending, consumer confidence, things of that nature are plummeting on Trump's watch. One more clip, and then we'll briefly examine an article discussing the potential imminent Trump inflation or Trump recession.
Joel, Lindsay Group came out with a report a couple of weeks ago that I've mentioned a few times. Can Doge induce a recession? No, it can't, okay? You're not going to get a recession just from Doge. Now, there are other things that have happened in this economy with this slowdown. We could see a recession, but it's not going to happen just because they're cutting waste and abuse out of this government, Joel.
Again, no evidence that they're actually cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. We've discussed this in previous videos. They won't even substantiate the claim. Doge won't even substantiate the claim. They're asking us to take it as an article of faith, which I refuse to do. But again, note that Maria Bartiromo is acknowledging that we could see a recession.
Yeah, no, you're exactly correct. In fact, of the last 5 years, we had about 3.1 million jobs, and about more than half were from government and from social services. And so those need to go. Now,
So there you have it. That's a panel of MAGA Fox News hosts panicking about the potential of a Trump recession, even though they're desperate to blame it on somebody else. I want to briefly review this article by economic columnist Heather Long of the Washington Post. She says a Trump recession has become a real possibility. Widespread tariffs and swift government cuts add pain to an already slowing economy. Americans are growing fearful of a recession. It's not here yet, but Donald Trump is steering the country towards a downturn with his tariffs and cuts to spending and the federal workforce for no logical reason. Trump has raised tariffs to their highest level since the 1940s. The scale and scope of his levies on imports from China, Mexico, and Canada are beyond anything he imposed in his first term. And so when people, again, say, well, Trump used tariffs in his first term and they weren't inflationary, again, they were disastrous because it triggered a trade war with China that hurt American farmers. But the reason that they weren't largely inflationary is because they weren't widespread 25% tariffs. So again, it's very dishonest. And he's only just begun. By Thursday, he granted a 1-month pause on tariffs on most Mexican and Canadian imports, but he is threatening reciprocal tariffs on almost all imports starting April 2nd. Wall Street banks have in turn hiked their probabilities for a 2025 recession. Even economist Ed Yardeni, one of the most optimistic forecasters, said in a note that he is, quote, raising the odds of a tariff-induced recession from 20% to 35%. Almost every economist I talk with uses words such as uncertain, jitters, and shaky to describe the situation. Trump's whipsaw actions have put businesses and consumers on edge, and they might pull back on hiring and spending. This could lead to a downward spiral. government cutbacks triggering layoffs in the private sector, and spending cuts in healthcare, education, and nonprofit services, which necessitate reductions at restaurants, stores, and so on. Early signs of trouble are apparent. Consumer confidence has plunged to its lowest level since 2023. Consumer spending tanked in January. A scary chart from the Atlanta Federal Reserve shows the economy nosediving to a negative 2.4% contraction in the first quarter. This is only a forecast and is extremely skewed because companies are rushing before the tariffs to take effect to bring in imports, which detract from growth. Most economists anticipate growth around 1.5% in the first quarter once all the data comes in, a slowdown, not a total collapse. But the heart of the economy, consumer spending, is starting to weaken. Affluent Americans are spooked by stock market declines and a bond market signaling slow growth, or worse. Meanwhile, middle-class retail brands are struggling. Starbucks, Target, and Applebee's have seen declining sales. Restaurant owners say customers are, quote, skipping appetizers or desserts. John Payton, chief executive of Dine Brands Global, which owns Applebee's, told investors on Wednesday, quote, in 2024, macro headwinds significantly impacted consumer spending. This especially affected guests with household incomes of less than $75,000. Now, these consumers are getting hit with roughly $1,000 in extra cost because of Trump's latest tariffs. In addition to tariff fears, people have layoff anxiety. Hiring was already anemic, and the latest data from the ADP indicates that in this uncertain time, even sectors that were bright spots last year, including healthcare, are pulling back. The belief that there will be fewer jobs in 6 months has surged to its highest level in more than a decade, according to the Conference Board's survey of consumers. Put this all together, and it's a recession tinderbox. Growth and hiring were already slowing at the start of the year, and now Trump is inciting an economic storm. The big question is why he's doing this. At first, it appeared he merely wanted quick wins that he could tout at daily press events. Few people thought his tariffs would last long, but his rhetoric and actions have grown more alarming. He talks as though he truly believes tariffs can bring back millions of jobs and substantial revenue. They can't. That's where we are, folks. That's where we are. That is why that panel of MAGA Fox News hosts are publicly panicking. It's why Maria Bartiromo, in an interview with Donald Trump earlier today, the time of recording, which we did a video about, was basically confronting him as gently as she could, but confronting him because she is very nervous about the economy that he is stewarding, knowing that as much cope as she wants to, Donald Trump will be blamed, especially because hopefully Democrats will work overtime to draw that connection between the American people and Trump and whatever potential economic downturns they may face. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.